We can now speak to Anthony Chan. He's the former chief economist at JP Chase. Welcome to the program.
Happy to be here.
I want to start with that rare decision for China to not set an economic growth target this year. The first time this is happening since records began in 1990. One, how surprised are you by this? And two, how significant is it?
Well, I don't think too many people outside of China are surprised. You got to keep in mind that the targets have been between 6 and 6.5%. And this year, China will probably be growing somewhere between 1 and 1.5%. And so to set a target at such a low number would certainly not be very productive, and it might cause some people to get nervous. But the reality is that when you look at Chinese growth, if it comes in that range that I've just mentioned, it's quite impressive. In the United States, for example, we're probably going to see 6 to 6.5% declines in real GDP growth. In Europe, we're going to see something quite similar. And even if you go to many of the Latin American economies, virtually all of them are going to see declines in real GDP in 2020. So for China to actually experience small positive growth, I think, is impressive itself, even though it's not as encouraging when you compare the prior growth targets that they've had in recent years. But the reality is, with COVID-19, they could not grow at 6 to 6.5% this year.
I'm glad you brought in that comparison for perspective, because Premier Li Keqiang has announced a series of measures, including more government borrowing, tax cuts, reductions in rent, even the cost of internet, all part of a $500 million stimulus. How will you compare these with what other major economies are doing?
Well, I think other major economies are also acting quite aggressively. If you look at China, for example, and you look at their budget deficit or fiscal deficit, in addition to all the off-balance sheets, the so-called augmented deficit is going to be 15.1%, I estimate, this year for China. And that compares to the previous year, that'll be an incremental increase of about 3.2%. So I don't think it's as aggressive as say, the United States, but it's still impressive, and it's still going to generate positive economic growth in China. And unfortunately, in the United States, we are not going to see positive economic growth in 2020, even though you will see that in China. So by that metric, I think that what China is doing is quite impressive.
Anthony, what sectors would you say need to turn around quickly to help the Chinese economy get back on track?
I think that right now for China, the most important sector that is lagging is simply the service sector. Yes, the economy is coming back, and the manufacturing sector is coming back. If you look at the purchasing manager surveys, many of those tell you that manufacturing is coming back very strongly. And in fact, the only thing hurting the manufacturing sector, if you can find a catalyst, is the fact that global economic growth is going to contract this year. The IMF, of course, has told us already that you're going to see negative economic growth in 2020, and you're going to see a rebound next year. But more recently, they're even a little bit more cautious about the rebound for 2021. But the service sector in China is still quite sluggish because of the nervousness. So maybe more initiatives by the Chinese to create more and generate more confidence among the Chinese people to start going out, start entertaining. But of course, that will come as you continue to report more and more good news as to no cases of COVID-19. That's not only true in China, that's true anywhere in the world. If you have good news on the healthcare front, people will feel more comfortable, and the service sector will recover. But so far, that's been the weak link in China.
And you talk about more confidence. The government has also really tried to focus on domestic consumption as a means of driving growth, but unemployment figures are near historic highs. How do you see them being reconciled?
Well, you're going to see an increase in unemployment in China simply because you're not growing as rapidly. You need to have faster growth to actually absorb that natural growth in the labor force in China, which is much greater than what you see in the United States. But again, if you want comparison, I think in the United States, we're going to probably see unemployment rates in the neighborhood of 20 to 25% this year. You're certainly not going to see that in China. You're going to see very low single-digit unemployment rates in China. And of course, with your 9 million goal for job creation, that's pretty impressive. In the United States, we've seen almost 40 million people filing for unemployment insurance, basically losing their jobs. we're not going to see any job creations in the United States. And when China announces a job creation target, they usually exceed it. You saw that last year, they exceeded their job creation target by almost 2 million. I think that I'm fairly confident that even if they don't exceed the 9 million target, that they'll come very, very close to that. We're not going to see anything like that in the United States this year.
Interesting times ahead. Anthony Chan, thank you so much for your insight.
My pleasure.